Well, I am Jagendra Rana. Good morning. Topic for our discussion today is India's space insurance. India's space insurance. As India accelerates its push towards increased privatization of its space economy, a major financial and legal vulnerability remains unaddressed. The absence of a robust third-party liability framework. So, with India increasingly launching private satellites of both domestic and foreign private entities, including allowing private entities to also act as launch service providers from Indian soil, it's only a matter of time before a third-party liability claim arises under international law, leaving Indian taxpayers to bear the cost of damages instead of the private operators. While India has made commendable progress in streamlining approvals and enabling commercial launches, the regulatory framework pertaining to financial liability remains fragmented and lacks a comprehensive approach to the entire space mission life cycle. So one liability claim away from a crisis. Consider this scenario. ISRO, that is Indian Space Research Organization, or an Indian space startup launches a private satellite for either a foreign or domestic company, which later collides with a third country's space assets, causing millions in damages. So such third country can, under the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 and the Liability Convention of 1972, India is a signatory of both, to bring a claim against the Government of India for compensation. Now, India as the launching state would be liable to pay compensation to such third country regardless of whether the satellite was operated by a private company. This liability regime under the international space law is precisely why other spacefaring nations such as the United Nations, Australia, France, etc. mandate private operators to carry third-party liability insurance for entire mission life cycle and to also sign a cross waiver of liability clause to safeguard the state. Now, since India is not doing so, the burden of financial liability would ultimately fall on the Indian government and by extension Indian taxpayers. The current space policy being applied through the norms, guidelines and procedures published by InSpace mandates insurance coverage only for the first stage of the launch and only mandates it for a launch operators. So this is a narrow approach that does not fully recognize India's liability obligations under international law. So as per the OST and the Liability Convention, India as a launching state remains fully liable for any damage caused by space objects launched from its territory for the entire life cycle of such space objects. So this is in addition to the opaqueness of the policy, which leaves everything to be determined by InSpace, such as minimum amount of insurance period and other terms and conditions of the insurance. In the absence of a well-defined liability regime, the Indian state could face massive financial exposure in the event of an accident that damages foreign satellites, aviation assets or property on Earth or in outer space. This is in the era of an increasingly cluttered low Earth orbit around us, and with projects like Starlink, we would consistently be on the risk of footing the bills of damaged, expensive space objects of other countries. So international space law imputes liability on states that launch or procure launchings of space objects and states from whose territory or facility space objects are launched. If a private entity satellite generates space debris due to their negligence, India would be internationally liable for damages caused by such space debris, since a non-functional state of a space object does not change its legal status. So given such a liability regime in the context of India's push to become a preferred launch destination for international customers, isn't it pertinent that we align our liability framework with global best practices, or at least give more thought to it? Now, a better way to approach this would be to have a mandatory third-party liability insurance for all space missions, covering all stages, launch and orbit operations and re-entry. A structured cross-waiver regime between governmental agencies, that is ISRO, NSIL, InSpace, and private space entities to distribute risk. A national space insurance pool similar to India's nuclear liability insurance model to provide coverage for damages beyond a certain maximum threshold. So incentives for private insurers and reinsurers to develop comprehensive space insurance products in India, which could help bring down PM costs. As India positions itself as a global leader in space technology, it cannot afford to have a reactionary approach to liability management. The rapid commercialization of the sector demands a forward-looking regulatory strategy. This would be a win-win for both the government and private sector, as simply mandating third-party liability insurance on private operators is not feasible, given that the premium rates are very high in the space sector. So the government of India, along with the InSpace, need to enter into a dialogue with the space startups in India, as well as insurers, and come out with a more holistic and pragmatic approach to space insurance. A few lines, a reactionary or an approach decided in silo would not yield the results in space is looking for. The cost of inaction is simply too high. So India's research space policy says the Indian Space Research Organization released the Indian Space Policy 2023 that had been in the works for some years. The policy has been welcomed as a progression towards India's entry in a new space age. However, it needs to forward a suitable legislation accompanied by clear rules and regulations. So until the early 1990s, India's space industry and space economy were defined by ISRO. Private sector involvement was limited to building to ISRO designs and specifications. Now the India Space Policy 2023 unveils the government's plan to let private enterprises carry out end-to-end activities from launching satellites and rockets into space to operating Earth stations. So what were India's past quests to reform the space sector? The first satellite communication policy, it was introduced in 1997 with guidelines for foreign direct investment and the satellite industry that were further liberalized but never generated much enthusiasm. Then remote sensing data policy, it was introduced in 2001, which was amended in 2011. And in 2016, it was replaced by National Geospatial Policy that has been further liberalized in 2022. Then Draft Space Activities Bill, it was brought out in 2017, which went through a long consultative process and lapsed in 2019 with the outgoing Lok Sabha. So the government was expected to introduce a new bill by 2021, but it appears to have contented itself with a new policy statement led by ISRO. India lags far behind in space economy. The global space economy is currently valued at about $360 billion. But despite being one among the few spacefaring nations in the world, India accounts for only about 2% of the space economy. So harnessing the full potential of India's space sector, today while ISRO budget is approximately $1.6 billion, India's space economy is over $9.6 billion. So broadband, OTT and 5G promise a double-digit annual growth in satellite-based services. It is estimated that with the enabling environment, the Indian space industry could grow to $60 billion by 2030, directly creating more than 2 lakh jobs. The private sector has revolutionized the space sector. Companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic have revolutionized the space sector by reducing costs and turnaround time, while in India, however, players within the private space industry have been limited to being vendors or suppliers to go to the government's space program. Then enhancing security. The Security and Defense Agencies spend nearly $1 billion annually to procure Earth observations, data and imagery from foreign sources. So this much reliance on foreign entities can put India's security at stakes. Now bringing Atmanirbharta in the space sector. Today more than half the transponders beaming TV signals into Indian homes are hosted on foreign satellites, resulting in an annual outflow of over $500 million. So promoting entrepreneurship in the space sector, there is a need to promote private sector activity in all high technology areas, including space, to fully unlock the potential of India's youth and entrepreneurs. But to realize this vision, it is necessary to enable private entities within the Indian space sector to establish themselves as independent players, capable of end-to-end space activities, then making space industry at par with global industry. Promoting the private sector will enable the Indian space program to remain cost competitive within the global space market, and thus creates several jobs in the space and other related tech sectors. So the vision is to enable, encourage and develop polarizing commercial presence in a space that suggests an acceptance that the private sector is a critical stakeholder in the entire value chain of the space economy. So the policy creates 4 distinct but related entities that will facilitate greater private sector participation in activities that have usually been the traditional domain of the ISRO. So in space, Indian National Space Promotion and Authorization Center, it will be a single window clearance and authorization agency for space launches, establishing launch pads, buying and selling satellites and disseminating high resolution data, among other things. It will also share about technologies, products and process and best practices with NSEs. It will be responsible for commercializing space technologies and platforms created through public expenditure, as well as manufacturing, leasing or procuring space component technology platforms and other assets from the private or public sector. So the Space Policy 2023 is a forward-looking document reflecting good intentions and a vision. But it is not enough. What is urgently needed is a time frame to provide necessary legal framework to translate this vision into reality, to successfully launch India into a second space age. The government should bring a bill that grants statutory status to InSpace and also sets out time limit for ISRO and space. Thank you very much.